Again, tested. That's the topic this morning, and it's taken from Genesis chapter 39, verses 19 through 23. If you've been following along in my messages, you know I've been kind of camping out on Joseph here, only because I find him to be a very fascinating character like I do David. But there are other women in the Bible that we're going to start studying about that are equally as fascinating and very much an important part of spreading God's word. But Genesis chapter 39, beginning at verse 19, starts as follows. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. This picture that you're seeing is Howie Rutledge. In November of 1965, Officer Rutledge's fighter jet exploded under enemy fire, and he parachuted into the hands of the North Vietnamese Army and was promptly shown to room 7 of what they called the Hanoi Hilton Hotel, which was made for prisoners of war. In his book called In the Presence of Mine Enemies, Commander Rutledge wrote, "It's hard to describe what solitary confinement can do to unnerve and defeat a man. You quickly tire of standing up and sitting down, sleeping or being awake. There are no books, no paper or pencils, no magazines or newspapers. The only colors that you see are drab, gray, and dirty brown. Months or years may go by when you don't see the sunrise or the moon or the green grass or flowers. You are locked in, alone and silent in your filthy little cell, breathing stale, rotten air and just trying to keep your sanity." Now, few, if any of us, have ever faced, those kinds of conditions. But it seems to me that at least to one degree or another, we all spend time behind some sort of prison, some bars. A young mother maybe who's just been diagnosed with lupus, and she's now been incarcerated, so to speak, by her bad health. Or a man who feels stuck and guilty for feeling stuck because his wife battles depression. So he's been kind of chained to gloom. And after 50 years of marriage, the husband begins to lose his memory. His wife had to take his car keys so that he couldn't drive. She has to stay nearby so he won't fall. They had hopes as a couple of growing old together, and they still may. But only one of them will probably know what day of the week it is. And each of these individuals begin to wonder, why would God allow these kinds of things to happen? Does this struggle serve any purpose whatsoever? And I'm thinking that Joseph probably had similar questions. If Mrs. Potiphar couldn't flirt Joseph into her bed, well, she'd force herself on him. And she grabbed for his robe, and he let her have it by letting her keep his robe because he ran away. And when he ran, she made up a story. And when Potiphar came home, she was ready with her lie, and Joseph's coat was now her evidence. So Potiphar charged him with sexual assault and locked him in jail. And it wasn't any kind of prison in the modern sense, but a maze of underground, windowless rooms with damp floors and stale food when it came. Guards shoved him into the prison and slammed the door, and as Joseph leaned back against the wall and slid to the floor, he mutters, I was kidnapped from my homeland, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. Now, I'm not making up those words. That's what Genesis chapter 40, verse 15 says. Joseph had a reaction like all of us would if we were under those same circumstances. I was kidnapped from my homeland, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. Joseph had done his best in Potiphar's house, as we studied last week. He'd made his boss a fortune. His chores were done. His room was tidy. He'd adopted now to this new culture in which he had found himself thrown into. He'd resisted the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife. And how was he rewarded by his faithfulness? A prison sentence with absolutely no hope of parole. Since when does taking the high road lead to driving off the cliff? And the answer? Well, the answer can be found in the events of Genesis chapter 3. Because disaster to this world came in the form of Lucifer, the fallen angel. And as long as Satan prowls around like a roaring lion, which is what 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 says, he will wreak havoc among God's people. That's just a fact. He will lock preachers like Paul in prison. He will exile pastors like John to remote islands. He will afflict friends of Jesus like Lazarus with diseases. But his strategies always backfire. The imprisoned Paul wrote epistles. The banished John saw heaven. The cemetery of Lazarus became a stage upon which Christ performed probably one of his greatest miracles. Intended evil becomes ultimate good. Granted, there's nothing trite about your wheelchair or your empty pantry or your aching heart, that's for sure. These are uphill, into the wind challenges that all of us face. They're not easy. But I wanted to let you know they're not random either. God is not sometimes sovereign and sometimes he's not. He is not occasionally victorious. He doesn't occupy the throne one day and then give it up or vacate it the next. The Lord shall not turn back until he has executed and accomplished the thoughts and intents of his mind. That's what the prophet Jeremiah said in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 24. You know, the season in which collectively we find ourselves, this coronavirus pandemic, or perhaps a different season for you, or several seasons all at one time, you know, it may puzzle us, but it doesn't really bewilder God. He'll use it for his purpose. Here's a case in point. From our perspective, the Egyptian jail in which Joseph found himself appeared to be tragic and the conclusion of Joseph's life. Satan could chalk up a victory essentially for the dark side. All the plans to use Joseph ended with the slamming of the jail door. At least that's what Satan thought. The devil had Joseph just where he wanted him, but you know what? So did God. There in prison, they bruised Joseph's feet with fetters, placed his neck in an iron collar, until the time came to fulfill his word. The Lord tested Joseph's character. That's what the psalmist says in Psalm 105, verses 18 and 19. The Lord was testing Joseph's character. What Satan had intended for evil, God used for testing. And in the Bible, the word test or tested or testing is an external trial that purifies or prepares the heart. Just as fire is used to refine gold into silver, to get all the junk and the impurities out of those precious stones, a trial purges the heart of the same thing. One of the psalmists wrote in Psalm 66, verses 10 through 12, "For you, O God, tested us. You refined us like silver. You brought us into prison and laid burdens on our backs. You let men ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance." You see, church, every day God tests us, maybe through people or through pain or through problems. And if you don't believe it, I want you to stop and consider your circumstances for a moment. For a moment, can you identify today your tests today? Now, maybe traffic wasn't a problem, but certainly the weather. It's supposed to be 114 degrees today. Living in Ramona, it was 117. I mean, there's just no enthusiasm to do anything except for drink iced tea and just try and stay as cool as you could. About 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I told my wife, I said, I'm getting cranky because I'm hot and I'm getting bored. And we have the good fortune of having a swimming pool. So I just jumped into the swimming pool. And that was just absolutely refreshing. And for 5 or 10 minutes, took my mind off my headache, took my mind off my boredom, and it was just a sense of refreshment that had come over me in a very short period of time. So, I don't know, maybe you have aching joints, maybe you're in isolation because of the coronavirus. And if you see your troubles as nothing more than just isolated hassles and isolated hurts, you're just going to get bitter and angry like I was yesterday. I could feel myself getting grouchy because I felt like I was a victim of my circumstances. But if you see your troubles as tests that are used by God for His glory and your maturity, then even the smallest incident takes on what becomes eternal significance. Each day it seems like has a pop quiz. And there are seasons in life that for us seem more like finals rather than midterm exams. They're brutal. They're sudden pitfalls of stress or sickness or sadness. And like Joseph, you've done your dead level best. Like Joseph, your best was rewarded now with incarceration. You think, what could possibly be the purpose of these tests? Anticipating that very question, here's what James wrote in James chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. "For when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be strong in character and ready for anything." Now we know that as a boy, Joseph was prone to softness, right? He was treated like the prize calf by his father. Jacob indulged him, spoiled him. Joseph talked about his dreams and his grand ambitions. Maybe he was just too full of himself. Even in Potiphar's house, Joseph was like the darling of the estate. Potiphar turned everything over to Joseph to run everything. In fact, last week we studied and it said the only thing Potiphar worried about is what meal he was going to have. So he left everything to Joseph. So Joseph had been quickly promoted. He was easily noticed. Success came very easily and quickly for Joseph. But maybe with that success came a little bit of pride as well. And if so, a prison term could certainly fix pride, because you've been brought down to basically nothing. God knew the challenges that laid ahead for Joseph way down the road. And He used Joseph's time in prison to strengthen him for the future. Genesis chapter 39, verse 22 says, "And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing." Well, if you want to talk about a crash course in leadership, that's exactly what God had provided now for Joseph. Joseph managed willing servants in Potiphar's household, but in prison, he's assigned to unruly, disrespectful, and ungrateful men. Joseph could have cloistered himself in the corner of his jail cell and mumbled, I've learned my lesson. I'm not running anything for anybody anymore. But Joseph didn't complain. He didn't criticize. He displayed a willing spirit, even with the prisoners, because he was especially kind to two of them, a baker and a butler. Both were officers of Pharaoh. Both were placed in Joseph's care because they're now sharing the same prison that Joseph is. One morning he noticed frowns on their faces. Now he could have dismissed their expressions. What concern was their sorrow to Joseph? Why would he care about them? Who cared if they were sullen or bitter? We're all in the same boat. We're all prisoners. Why should I care about how you're feeling today? But for whatever reason, Joseph took an interest in them. In fact, the first recorded words of Joseph in prison were really very kind words. Genesis chapter 40, verse 7 says, "Why do you look so sad?" So picture yourself in a prison cell like Joseph, there for no reason whatsoever, only for doing what was right rather than what was wrong. And now you're going to have a chippy, happy attitude toward fellow prisoners? I don't know that I could do that. But Joseph did. Because his observation was, these two men have frowns on their faces. Why? Why are you so downtrodden? Why are you so sullen? Joseph had been abandoned by his brothers. He'd been sold into slavery. He'd been unjustly imprisoned. Joseph was still, notwithstanding all those things, still kind and sensitive and tender to others. And wouldn't compassion really be a suitable quality for the future director of the worldwide hunger relief program that eventually Joseph was appointed to? If you were tasked as the second in command of Egypt to distribute foodstuffs for your nation and surrounding nations, wouldn't you need to have some compassion? Well, maybe this experience in prison helped grow Joseph in that area of his life, to start demonstrating and showing compassion and kindness to others. But even then, God wasn't finished. Both the baker and the butler were troubled by their dreams. And in his dream, the butler saw a vine with 3 grape-bearing branches. And he saw in his dream that he had pressed these grapes into the Pharaoh's cup and gave it to the Pharaoh. And the baker, he dreamed about bread. 3 baskets of bread were on his head, and birds were eating the bread in the topmost basket. Both men sought Joseph's counsel. What do you think this means? And Joseph received an interpretation from God to tell them what it meant. But the question is, would he share it? He didn't have to, because the last time Joseph spoke about dreams, he ended up in a hole in the ground, right? So Joseph is a little reluctant to share his interpretation of this dream with 2 fellow prisoners, because the last time he did that did not work out well for him. Besides, only half of the revelation that he was going to share was good news, right? If called to stand before Pharaoh, would Joseph accurately convey God's word? You see, church, this was another test. God was giving Joseph the ability to give information to 2 men, one of which was good. The cupbearer was going to go back to serve the Pharaoh. The baker was going to lose his head in 3 days. And God had given him this interpretation for both men. Would he only share the good and not the bad? kind of keep that in his hip pocket because he didn't really want to share the good news. But if Joseph is eventually going to be promoted as second in command to Pharaoh, and God gives Joseph a word, will Joseph be trusted to tell Pharaoh everything? And so for Joseph, again, this was a test. And this was a test that Joseph passed because he gave the butler good news. You'll be out in 3 days. And the baker, he gave him bad news. You'll be dead in 3 days. One would get a new start, the other would get a dirt bath. Both, however, received the truth. Do you see? It's like test, 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 test. I mean, the dungeon looked like a prison. It smelled like a prison. It probably even sounded like a prison. But had you asked the angels of heaven about Joseph's location, they would have replied, oh, it's not a prison. He's just in boot camp. He's receiving his training. This chapter in your life, it might smell like rehab. It might smell like unemployment. It might sound like a hospital. But if you were to ask the angels, oh, she's in training. You know, God hasn't forgotten you. It's just the opposite when you think about it. He has chosen to train you. The Hebrew word for test comes from a word that means to take a keen look at, to look carefully, or to choose. So I want you to dismiss the notion that God doesn't see or understand your individual test or struggle. On the contrary, God is completely engaged because he sees the needs of tomorrow and uses your circumstances to create the test of today. And doesn't God have the authority to do that? Well, of course he does. I mean, he's the potter, right? And we're the clay. He's the shepherd. We're the sheep. He's the gardener. We're the branches. He's the teacher. We're the students. And we need to learn to trust in God's training. If God can make a prince out of a prisoner, don't you think he can make something good out of you too? Don't forget, too, that tests are temporary. They're limited in duration. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 says, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now, for a little while, you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." Tests don't last forever, because life doesn't. Job chapter 8, verse 9, "We were born but yesterday. Our days on earth are as transient as a shadow." And the truth of the matter is, some tests will end here on earth, but all tests will ultimately end in heaven. In the meantime, I think it would be good for us to follow Joseph's example, to let God train us. I mean, he's watching the way you handle the little jobs as he's assigned to each of you to do. If you're faithful with a few things, he'll set you over much. That's what Matthew said in Matthew chapter 25, verse 21, quoting Jesus. Joseph succeeded in the kitchen and in the dungeon long before he succeeded in Pharaoh's court. He cared for the butler and the baker long before he cared for the nations whom Egypt would eventually feed. The reward for good work is many times greater work. So, do you aspire to do great things in God's kingdom? Well, if so, then excel in the small ones. Show up on time. Finish your work early. Don't complain. Let others grumble in the corner of the prison cell, but not you. Because you know how God shapes his servants, right? Today's prisoner may be tomorrow's prime minister, for all we know. When you're given a task, just then take it on. When you see a hurt, address it. I mean, what if Joseph had ignored the sadness on the faces of Pharaoh's officers? What if he'd focused on his needs and ignored theirs altogether? Would God have still liberated him from prison? Well, we don't know, but we do know this. The kindness of Joseph opened the door of the jail because the butler introduced Joseph to Pharaoh. Compassion matters a great deal to God. It matters a lot. And this is the time for service, not for self-centeredness. So we need to kind of cancel the pity party and love the people that God brings to us. And then share the message that God gives to you. I mean, your test may very well become your testimony. Paul, in writing to the church in Corinth, in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4 said, God comes alongside us when we go through hard times, and before you know it, he brings us alongside someone else who is going through hard times so that we can be there for that person just as God was there for us. I mean, you didn't sign up for that crash course in single parenting, I know, or caring for a disabled spouse. I know that. You know that. But the reason is because God enrolled you for a purpose. He's taken the intended evil and rewoven it into his curriculum. Well, okay, but then why? Why would God do that? So you can teach what others taught you. That's why. Your mess now becomes your message. Rather than say, why, God, maybe we should ask a different question. Maybe we should say, what, God? Not why, but what? What are you trying to teach me? What are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to share with me? What can I learn from this experience? Because remember today what you have learned about him, the Lord, through your experiences with him. That's what the writer of Deuteronomy, chapter 11, verse 2 said. Remember today what you have learned about the Lord through your experiences with him. Rather than asking God to change your circumstances, maybe ask God to change your circumstances to change you. Life is a required course, so you might as well do your best to pass it. God is at work in each of us, church, whether we know it or not, whether we want it or not. In Lamentations chapter 3, verse 33, it says, he takes no pleasure in making life hard, in throwing roadblocks in the way. He does not relish our sufferings, but he delights in our development. The Philippian writer, Paul, to the church in Philippi, Philippians chapter 1, verse 6 said, God began doing a good work in you, and I am sure he will continue it until it is finished when Jesus Christ comes again. Church, he won't fail. He never fails. He cannot fail. He will work in us what is pleasing to him. That's what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 21. So don't see your struggles so much as an interruption in your life, but maybe as preparation for it. Because no one said the road would be easy or painless, but God will use your particular circumstances for good. This trouble you're in isn't punishment. It's training, the normal experience of children. God is doing what is best for us, training us to live God's holy best. That's what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 8. So we know that you can pass the test. Paul told a church in Corinth full of test takers just like us, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, all you need to remember is that God will never let you down. He'll never let you be pushed past your limit. He'll always be there to help you come through it. And with God, church, you'll stand the test of time. So despite the pandemic, despite the election upcoming and all the nastiness being thrown from either side, sometimes as Christians we look at this and just say, how could God be in this mess? Or we look at our own lives and some of the things that have happened to us, maybe losing a loved one or losing a job or whatever the case might be, and we wonder, how can God possibly be in this? But my encouragement to you this week, as you experience whatever test you may be going through, rather than asking why God, ask God what. What is it that you want me to understand from this so that I can be made a better child of yours, so that then I can take the mess that was my life and allow it to be the message to share with others who are now going down a similar path. See, for Joseph, it was bringing people along with him so that eventually he could accomplish God's purpose. He brought Potiphar along with him. He brought the baker along with him, brought the cupbearer along with him, brought a lot of people with him to finally reach that point in his life where he could then serve not only the nation, but then the surrounding nations who were starving to death. Remember, this was a brutal famine. There were 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. We've never been through something like that. I mean, we're losing our minds because it's going to be in excess of 100 degrees for like 5 or 6 days. But these are countries that were going through a famine for 7 years. People were starving to death. But Joseph had been tested throughout his life in the various and sundry things in which he was to help give him the character and the person and the personality to be able to deal with a very significant situation to save millions and millions and millions of people. If I were to tell you, if you'll just endure this test, I will tell you 10 years from now, you're going to be confronted by somebody that you'll have the perfect word to save for them and you'll save their life. If you knew that you were guaranteed to be in a position of influence to save somebody's life 10 years from now, and that life that you'd be saving means something to you, would you be willing to go through that test to maybe help you be a better person so that you could do that in the future? I don't know what your answer would be, but at least you know that this is a test for a reason. And sometimes God doesn't reveal to us what it is he has intended for us, but we do know that he's not doing it to make us miserable. It's not because, you're having it too good, let me knock you down a few pegs. God loves us. He sent his son Jesus to die for us so that we might live with him forever. So with that kind of a father, he's not just doing stuff to make you mad or make you upset. He's doing it for a purpose. And so this week, rather than asking God why, ask him what. What's the purpose? What is it that I can learn from this experience to apply in the future to maybe somebody else who is struggling just like I was? So hopefully this week you can have that kind of mindset. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a hot one. People dealing with the coronavirus, as we talked about earlier, are addressing it in multiple different ways. And we just need to be sensitive and gracious to those people. They may not be behaving or relating to it the way that we do, but that doesn't make it right or wrong. That's just what they're doing. So let's help them along as well. So if you have any prayer requests, you can hand them up now. Steve is going to lead us in a closing song. At the conclusion of that song, if we have any prayer requests, we'll talk about that, and then we'll close our services with a prayer and thankfulness for an offering. So let's stand.